One of the main developmental tasks of the adolescent stage is the journey to form one's identity. In today's world, some of the most compelling, dangerous, and misdirected cultural messages are leading kids down wrong paths as they look for answers to the question, who am I? Dr. Carl Trueman has written a great new book that helps us understand and address these issues. We love chatting with Carl about his practical, hope-filled, and theologically informed cultural observations. Today is no exception, as Duffy Robbins and I learn from Carl and his new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution, on this enlightening episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Well, this is a podcast episode I've really been looking forward to for a couple of reasons, and both of those reasons are people who are friends and good thinkers who really have served the church well for a long time, and we're trusting are continuing and will continue to serve the church well. Certainly Duffy Robbins, who is professor of Christian ministries at Grove City College, and then his colleague, Dr. Carl Trueman, who teaches at Grove City as well, professor of biblical and religious studies. They're with us today. Let me start. Duffy, thanks for coming on. I know you're a regular co-host here, and it's always a challenge to get the technology right, but I just want to affirm you this morning. You did a good job.
Well, yeah, thanks. We're very excited. The Ethernet connection is as good as it is. All that noise dialing up and stuff was pesky, but it's good to be with you guys.
Yeah, and you did tell Maggie, don't pick up the phone.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. We don't want any interruptions. So thanks for doing that. And then, Duffy, why don't you say a word about your colleague there, Dr. Carl Trueman from Grove City?
Well, actually, what's kind of fun is that Carl came exactly when I did, and so both of us kind of learning the ropes at the same time, and his being there and being hired by Grove City is a confirmation of why I went to teach at Grove City. And then when I think about my students being able to take his courses and being trained for ministry, whether it's youth ministry or other kinds of ministry, I love that because I know that they're getting, and not just Carl, but the other guys as well, other ladies and gentlemen as well, but I love the kind of meat that they're getting. And aside from that, Carl plays rock and roll music loudly in his office, and he's just a door down. But aside from that, it's pretty good if you can develop a taste for 80s rock bands.
Well, we need to talk about that. I mean, eventually here, I hope eventually we get to Carl's new book, which is absolutely outstanding.
We may not have time for that.
We might not, as we talk about music, but I got to tell you, before Carl comes on, there's two things I think about. One is I still can't get over the fact that he has this obsession that's no longer a secret to us with meatloaf. And I'm not talking about what you eat. I still, this is just boggling my mind. It is. And Carl, as I was thinking about this, a couple of posters, and I looked up a bunch of Meatloaf songs and lyrics. And I'm deeply troubled for you right now. I get it. Yeah. So do you want to defend yourself here, or?
I just think that Meatloaf is a much maligned but major contribution of America to world culture. Admittedly, it's America. The competition isn't that
Right,
fierce.
right.
But I think Meatloaf's in the upper 20% of American contributions to world culture.
And the way you say that, it could be taken either to the actual food item or to the music, but you're talking about the music. Now let's switch here because you missed a Rolling Stones concert in Pittsburgh. You and your son were going to go to that, right?
We were planning to get tickets last summer, and of course it was canceled. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I'd hold out a whole lot of hope that you're going to get to see them, because last week I don't know if you've seen this. This is worth watching. There's a Rolling Stone concert in Havana, Cuba, that they're broadcasting now on the television network Axis. And I watched it. Two things there really were curious to me. One is it was in Havana. I'd been to Cuba, and of course, being my age and growing up during the Cold War, it's very surreal to think that the Rolling Stones played in Cuba, and to watch the crowd just sing along and really be into the music. But the other thing was, those four guys, and they have some backup musicians now. It is very interesting to me that they are all, from the neck down, incredibly thin, and like age has not made them look like others of us. But from the neck up, they, I mean, they have been drinking out of the same straw. It is unbelievable.
Well, one thing's clear, they've been drinking.
Yeah.
Well, I think
I don't know.
I think it was in around about 1968, 1969, Keith Richards in Britain was voted the man most likely to die soon. And he's still around.
And he still looks like the man most likely to die soon. But the other guys all look like him as well. It is amazing, when they go in on the other three. I don't know.
Maggie and I went to that. We watched that concert when it was on at the movies. It was one of those one night deals, and that's an amazing concert. I mean, I will say this about the guys: they may look frail, but I mean, they were amazing that night.
Yeah.
I mean, they were playing good music, way better than Meatloaf.
Well, let's cut Carl a break here. That's all a matter of opinion. But I do want to move on. Maybe we'll come back to music at some point here. But people need to be aware of this. And I was very excited about this before it came out, because I read about it. Carl's new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, subtitled Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism and the Road to Sexual Revolution. It's published by Crossway. It came out in November. This last November, and I was able to get a hold of an advanced reader copy and get through it. And as I started, just like the introduction and then the first chapter, everything I would say was worth the price of the book. Of course, I didn't pay anything for it because the publisher sent it to me as an advanced reader copy, but it is so worthwhile to read. And Carl, I'm going to say this, and I want youth workers, I want parents to hear this, that there are certain people that I really think are theologically, rich, deep, astute, right on, but then have that mix of cultural awareness and the being able to take that interdisciplinary approach as you look at the world around us, knowing both the word and the world. And I would, put people like Os Guinness and David Wells, Francis Schaeffer, certainly in that category. You're in there as well. And so I want to thank you for this. I think you've done us a great favor here, and it's good to get into your head as to how you process these things. Let me just start by, I want to read the first sentence from the introduction, because this really sets a course for the book, and then I'll let you take it from there and talk about kind of what went into this process and why you tackled this. But you said this, the origins of this book lie in my curiosity about how and why a particular statement has come to be regarded as coherent and meaningful. And here's the statement, quote, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, unquote. Talk about this project. I mean, it just seems like an insurmountable task. I don't know how you tackled this, but it's great.
Yeah, I had a year at Princeton, I had a fellowship at Princeton when I was working, and I had lunch with an old friend, Gordon Graham, who'd been, we were colleagues in Aberdeen many years ago, and he taught philosophy at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I was telling him about the project, and he sort of said to me, it's too big. It's like an octopus. I don't even know how you'd ever sort of squeeze that into a single book. So yeah, the book ended up being considerably more complicated in execution than I anticipated. Its origins lay in a three-way conversation between myself, Justin Taylor, the senior editor at Crossway, and Rod Dreher, the senior editor at the American Conservative. Rod wanted somebody to write a book on Philip Rieff, the psychological sociologist, because he thinks Rieff's notion of the therapeutic society is an extremely important one for understanding the world in which we live. And yet Rieff writes rather dense prose. It's hard to read Rieff. It verges on almost gobbledygook at times. So I agreed that I would take on that project to see if I could produce a sort of simple introductory guide to Rieff. And as I was working on that, it became clear to me that this sentence, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," which I genuinely had just a curiosity about in terms of how on earth did this thing come to make sense, not just to French deconstructionist professors, but to the ordinary man or woman in the street. Began to realize that actually a better, more interesting project would be to use Rieff in parts to try to understand the culture that had allowed that sentence to become coherent and cogent. So that was how the project started. And of course, at the time, I was also a pastor. I was not only a seminary professor at that point, but I was also a pastor, and beginning to be aware that members of my congregation were facing questions that one could never have anticipated. I've got a colleague who's transitioned and I'm being told to use the new pronouns. Can I, as a Christian, do that with a good conscience? Those kind of things. So there are a whole host of factors driving my interest in the project.
It was interesting to me as well. It just not only Rieff, who, for me with a background in sociology, I was not super familiar with him, but was interested in how you communicated, his whole scheme of things. And by the way, if it was gobbledygook when you read it, you did a good job translating it. I think you made it really understandable and it was helpful. But I love the way that you didn't just rely on him. You brought together the thought of others as well. Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, again, a very dense book that most people are not going to tackle. And then also Alistair McIntyre, right? Correct? So
yes,
talk a little bit about them and how, because let me give you a background of what I'm driving at here, because I think this is important for people who are boots on the ground with kids, youth workers and parents, to understand that we tend to be drawn to learning about the cultural trends. Hey, I want to know about transgenderism, or I want to know about, what's happening with kids with social media, or, why they're curating themselves. There are deeper, long-standing strains of thought development that have resulted in this that I really think we need to understand if we're actually going to, well, first understand what these issues are, but then address them in very practical ways. And so these are big ideas, but just talk a little bit about Taylor and McIntyre.
Sure. One of the things, of course, just as a general point, is my training's really as a historian. And one of the basic elements of being a historian is knowing that no event is its own cause. There's always a background. There's always a context. Every individual particular thing that happens always has a much broader background that you need to understand in order to connect the dots, if you like. So in approaching the issue of transgenderism, the big question in my mind was, okay, what's the general cultural framework that has formed, that has allowed this sentence to become a cogent and coherent one? And that's where I found these three, Rieff, but also Taylor and McIntyre, to be very helpful. I'll take McIntyre first. I do less with McIntyre in the book than with Taylor. I first read McIntyre maybe 30 years ago. His book After Virtue was profoundly influential on my thinking, because in that work, he really makes the point that a lot of modern ethical discourse, notions of right and wrong, a lot of it is up for grabs these days, because human beings, we no longer have an agreed narrative really on what it means to be a human being. And that means that quite often ethical discourse, we're shouting past each other. And very often when we say that something is wrong, what we're really saying is, I personally find that distasteful or disapprove of that. And that struck me as very important in the transformation of sexual morality that we've seen in recent years, where by and large people approving or disapproving of certain patterns of sexual behavior if you ask them why they approve or disapprove, can't really give a coherent reason. And it'll all come down to, well, I just find it distasteful, or I find that particular activity disgusting. So that was where McIntyre was useful to me. Taylor is just a polymath and is useful on so many different levels. One, I appreciate his broad method, which is sometimes frustrating, but on the whole, what he does is he tries to understand why societies and why individuals within the societies think the way they do without standing in judgment on them. If you like, the primary task of Taylor is to expound what he sees before him and explain it, rather than jumping in with value judgments. And I think often as Christians, particularly when we're dealing with matters of sexual morality and sexual behavior, the temptation is to go in sort of all guns blazing because we know what's right and wrong. And I wanted to sort of bracket that out in this book and say, okay, I know what's right and wrong in this, but I want to explain why this is happening in this way. So Taylor's method of exposition was very helpful. And then on a couple of other fronts, he's useful too. Taylor is very good at helping us understand that most people don't think about the world in terms of a comprehensive first principle philosophy. We tend to believe things because it's part of the world we inhabit. We intuit it. Evolution would be a good example. If I were to ask, the average man in the street, do you believe in evolution? He'd probably say yes. If I would then say to him, well, can you explain to me the complicated genetic science that has to be true in order for evolution to be true? He'd say, well, no, but human beings look a bit like monkeys. There's probably a connection, and experts tell us there is. So that's how we think about an awful lot of things. And I think particularly identity is something that we intuit a lot of the time. It's something we absorb from the culture around us without thinking it back to first principles. So I wanted to use Taylor to try to help understand the imaginary universe, if you like, we live in. That's not to say it isn't real, but it's to say we're actually imagining the world to be a certain way. How come Western societies, what Taylor calls social imaginary, the way Western people imagine the world, makes transgenderism plausible? So Taylor was very useful from that perspective. He's that rarest of things. He's an intellectual who understands the limitation of pure ideas in explaining how people think, that you have to look at a much more broader social and cultural framework to understand how the kids in your youth group or the guy in the pew on a Sunday actually thinks about the world.
Yeah. And what you're describing here, as you unpack this, a couple of things come to mind. One is when I think about Paul in Athens in Acts 17, how he was entering into a world where the mindset was completely different. You used the term social imaginary, which Taylor uses. It was completely different. And so he took the time to really listen to that and worked to unpack it so that he could speak truth into it. And, unchanging truth, biblical truth. And it's the same reality, now. And I'm also, as I think about it, this is missions work, right? That was the second thought I had. You're basically saying we've got to understand these things if we hope to be effective in our efforts at evangelism, in our efforts at discipleship, in our efforts at parenting, just even being effective in ministry. Let me ask Duffy real quick, just to jump over, because I know you've read as well, and your office is next to Carl's, so some of the vibes are coming through and getting into your head there, Duffy.
Sometimes it's really strong, yeah.
Yeah,
we have a common social imaginary in the bar's annex.
Yeah.
He comes over to admire the cardboard.
Yeah, I'm feeling it. It's coming through now. Duffy, you've been working with college students, university students for decades now. What Carl's talking about, even in a setting of Christian higher education, have you seen this? These shifts.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was thinking, Carl, one of the I guess devices that you used, I think it was fairly early in the book, that really kind of helped me to understand, and it might help our listeners to understand, again, your sort of overall project, was I guess you must do this in class where you said, you ask students, why did 9/11 happen? And I guess, they'll say, oh, because of Islamic terrorism, because we're in Israel or we're in the Middle East and they don't want us there, and because of bad choices politically. And you say, no, actually, that's not why 9/11 happened. The Twin Towers didn't fall down because of any of those things. And then you explain the Twin Towers fell on 9/11 because of the law of gravity. And it's that bigger story that you're trying to tell in this book. And I think that's a really brilliant way of getting at it. And as I was reading through, there were just a ton of phrases or ideas that that resonated with what I see and experience in working with teenagers. I mean, I'll just because we were talking about Philip Reef, I'll just mention one of them. One of the concepts that you sort of mention with him is a concept that I guess he developed called Deathworks. And I'll just read the definition, but I'd like you to speak to it. But that's an example. I think it's so relevant to young people in adolescent culture. This is his definition of Deathworks. An all-out assault upon something vital to the established culture. Every death work represents an admiring final assault on the objects of its admiration, the sacred orders of which their arts are some expression in the repressive mode. Talk a little bit about like Deathworks. If I'm a youth pastor or a parent, how would I see that fleshed out in real life? What is Reef observing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of background, of course, to what Reef says there, and part of it is his understanding of culture, and he uses culture in a very distinctive way. Often in Christian circles, when we talk about culture, we generally mean pop culture. We're sort of talking in rather vague terms about the artifacts of pop culture. When Reef talks about culture, he's really meaning those systems and practices that transmit cultural values from one generation to the next. So he has a fairly specific understanding. And one of the things that he sees as fundamentally changing in the modern world compared to previous cultures is that the elites of our culture are committed to the overthrowal of the values which they inherited from the past. And he sees that as a real change. In the past, you have the elites, the teachers, the politicians, etc. They were sort of guardians of tradition, we might say, and it was their task to communicate the past to the present and hence on to the future, not in a completely untransformed way, but in a way that was respectful rather than iconoclastic. Reef sees modern culture as really wanting to overthrow the past. We see some hints of this in the Enlightenment when Immanuel Kant writes his little essay, What is Enlightenment? And he sort of says, enlightenment is humanity becoming adult. Well, what does that mean? That really means setting aside childish things. And there's a kind of iconoclasm there. Well, what was the preserve of elite intellectuals in the early 19th century is now the common currency of us all. And Reef says what we see in society now are these death works, and these death works are produced by the cultural elite. They use the idioms of the previous culture that still have a powerful resonance with people, but they use them to destroy that culture. The example I draw on in the book, it's a somewhat distasteful one, but it's the infamous example of Andres Serrano's artwork. Don't mind me using this phrase, but Piss Christ, where the artwork consists of a picture of a crucifix of Christ submerged in a bottle of Serrano's own urine. And Reef would say that's a classic death work, because there you have what a previous culture considered to be sacred, and what still speaks powerfully to us. People still know in the 1980s, at least, when Serrano was controversial, the crucifix still symbolized something, but you have it being turned not into something that is that is worthy of reverence and awe, but has been sort of literally placed in the sewer. And I think Reef's comment is, the sacramental has been made excremental. We would see it today, I would say, in a lot of the pop lyrics, where sexual activity that was traditionally seen as an extremely significant thing, it was seen as as having, certainly in Christian circles, a sacred significance. It's analogous to the relationship between Christ and the church. It was an act that represented the movement into adulthood, the movement from the home to the establishment of a new home. It was procreative. It created new life. It's the most spectacularly powerful act any human being can engage in. That's now the smutty content of a myriad rap songs or a myriad rock songs, where it's been turned into nothing more than an animalistic bodily function. And Reef would say that's a death work too, because there you have art being used to debase the sacredness of sex. And tying that in with Taylor, I think one would say that, and these are the things that really influence how people think. Will and grace would be a good example, I think, relative to the gay marriage debate. It's not that people were reading great tomes of sexual theory or marriage theory and finding them wanting, and therefore opening up marriage to gay couples. It was that people watched Will and Grace and saw a sexual relationship, which should be a sacred thing, being presented as a kind of comical thing, a gay couple being presented as delightful and pleasant. And that was sort of shaping the way people thought about the cultural value of marriage. So Reef's notion of the death work, I think, it's not only an important aspect of his own thought, I think it's very useful for us today when we think about what is shaping the mindset of not just young people, but all of us who are exposed to these cultural artifacts. I mean, you mentioned at the start, I'm a Rolling Stones fan. Rolling Stones produced plenty of death works in their time.
Now it's, as I was reading through there, now it seems like there's almost a race to produce death works. I mean, that's sort of how you attain fame, and then you're sort of nominated as courageous for doing that, when in fact it's pretty much a trend. I mean, it's the courageous person would be the one who actually claims a history or looks to history in any sense.
Yeah, and if the role of the cultural elite is not the preservation of culture, but the transgression of inherited values, then this thing goes on and on and on, and it gets more and more dramatic. And there is no obvious end in sight, because, and it was interesting in the last election, Peter, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce his name, I think Pete Buttigieg. He was standing as one of the candidates for
mayor of South Bend.
That's right. It was interesting seeing some of the reaction to him in the LGBTQ press, because he was regarded as far too respectable. That, he's to use purely sexism, he's a happily married man. And he reeks of domestication. Well, happily married gay couples, they too are going to have their day when they're on the end of a death work, if you like. The nature of this culture is always to be transgressing that which has become normative, that which has become established.
I know we have to go to a break pretty quick, Walt, but I have another question about that. Do you want to wait till after the break?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's take a break. We're chatting with Dr. Carl Trueman about his new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's one that I think youth workers and parents would do well to read together in a group, maybe in a small group at your church. It requires some thinking, obviously, but what it's doing is getting under the surface to see the current, or we might say the bottom of the iceberg. We see the tip, but this really helps us understand what's happening in our world. We'll be right back and continue our conversation.
I want to tell you about one of our best kept resource secrets here at CPYU. For the last 14 years, we've produced a 1-minute daily radio spot called Youth Culture Today that's carried on over 800 radio stations in North America and which can be listened to through our online home at cpyu.org. Recently, we've relaunched, rebooted, and rebranded Youth Culture Today so that it will reach more parents and youth workers with timely and practical tips on how to help kids navigate the challenges and opportunities of living in today's world. We encourage you to visit our homepage at cpyu.org to experience a 1-minute daily dose of youth culture that will better prepare you to reach the kids you know and love. Or search for Youth Culture Today on your favorite podcast platform. Youth Culture Today is one more free resource we've created to help and support you as youth workers and parents.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to Youth Culture Matters. As we come out of the break, I just want to remind everybody that anything we mentioned today on this particular episode of the podcast, Chris Wagner here at CPYU, on our homepage at cpyu.org, just go there. He will have listed underneath the player for this particular episode all of the resources that are mentioned, and even those that are not. We'll point you to things that will be helpful, ways for you to know more about what Carl Trueman is involved in doing. I do want to mention that one of the places that I love to read Carl is in First Things. He's got some great articles there, and even some of the YouTube videos and things that are out there are great. There's stuff that still exists from when you were on tour with Meatloaf. Those are iconic. I mean, that was, when you opened for Carl, just picking him up was just amazing to watch.
Nobody's ever seen bagpipes in a kilt used in the rock genre. It was brilliant. By the way, will there be a discography of Meatloaf on the website, Chris, and also a recipe for Carl's favorite?
Yeah, we'll do both of those. And because we're here recording in Lancaster County, Duffy, we'll add to that ham loaf and try to expand Carl's horizons a little bit just to see.
I had that once. It was very painful.
You didn't like it?
Well, no, I had to go to the doctor 3 times. That animal thing was terrible.
You guys can mock, but Dead Ringer for Love is one of the peaks of Western culture as far as
Yeah. Well, now I've totally forgotten what we were actually going to say. But if you go, let me go back to that. Yeah, if you go to the cpyu.org and look for the player for this podcast, you'll see that. And I do want to thank people for, sometimes I forget this, for listening, for giving us a review, for subscribing, and for sharing the podcast with others. Please keep doing that. So before the break, we were talking, Duffy, I was glad you brought that up about that term Deathworks. And by the way, as I read this book, one of the things I do is underline. That's why I love paper. But I have circled, and I'm sure, Duffy, you do this. I mean, there were so many new terms to me. They were just so incredibly helpful.
Yes.
That being one of them that was just really, really good. But during the break, we were talking about the fact that, and you alluded to this beforehand, Carl, that there are, let's call them delivery mechanisms or channels in pop culture where Deathworks are delivered. I was thinking specifically as you were talking about the issue of sexuality, how, what was it, 1985, so almost 35 years ago, when Madonna really burst onto the scene at Live Aid, she was so far out there on the edge. And now when you think about how everybody tries to outdo everybody else, and then even, Madonna trying to outdo herself and moving further and further out there on the edge. And just yesterday I was watching, when you think about pop music, I was watching a video that's charting now, Megan Thee Stallion, if you know her story, and she's got this song in this video called Body. And it is stunning to me, when you write in here about the revolution of the self, man, that is like Exhibit A. When you watch that, you listen to the story behind that video. We probably need to do something on that here. But just delivery mechanism. And Duffy, you mentioned one particular delivery mechanism that I want you to bring up and ask about.
Yeah, well, shortly, Carl, after you talk about Philip Reef's term Deathworks, and I totally agree with Walt that there were just some great terminology in there. I mean, social imaginary was another one that really jumped out at me. But shortly after you mentioned Deathworks, you talked about another of Reef's sort of comments regarding satire and how satire is often a vehicle by which Deathworks are delivered. And as I was thinking about that, I thought a couple of things. First of all, as a person that speaks to a lot of teenagers, I know they appreciate satire. I appreciate good satire. I know satire is a huge part of adolescent culture. Youth workers use a lot of satire. I was sharing with these guys during the break that I watched recently the satire of a seeker-centered church worship service, a parody, and it was brilliant, and it was very, very funny. And so I understand what Reef is saying about how satire can be subversive and it can be a vehicle through which Deathworks are communicated. But I think it can also be something positive. And so I was wondering, Carl, if you talk about satire in our culture, positive, negative, how do we know the limits? What should I, as a communicator, how do I responsibly use that?
Well, I mean, just as a general point, I'd say one of the things I try to do in the book is avoid blanket condemnation of forms. It seems to me that technology is both a great thing. It gives us antibiotics. It gives us vaccines. It allows us to save lives. It also makes the Holocaust possible. So in a lot of human endeavors, we develop things that can be both brilliantly good and terrifyingly evil. And that's true in the world of ideas as well, and literary genres, if you like. Like you, I love satire. I was raised in the UK on Monty Python, Not the 9 o'clock news, just watching reruns on Amazon of Not the 9 o'clock news with my son, and amazed at how much of it still resonates today. Satire, I would say, has a very useful and important function. I'm just getting to my daily reading. I've just got to Isaiah 43. Well, of course, Isaiah 44 is one of the great satirical moments in the Bible where the prophet describes this man who chops down a tree and he uses half of it to cook his dinner. The other half he carves into a god and he bows down and worships it. And he never connects the dots. He never connects the wood as fuel with the wood as God, and wonders, how does this work? And to me, that's great biblical satire. And of course, what it's doing is it's really, I would say, mocking human pretensions with a view to cultivating self-awareness and humility, and ultimately pointing towards the truth. And I would say satire has an extremely useful function there when it, if you like, it cuts us down to size, when it becomes a way of putting ourselves in perspective, like humor in general puts us in perspective. It has a humbling function. At times it has a polemical function in cutting down evil rulers, whether they're in the workplace or at the national or international level. It has the function of cutting them down size. It's why satire is one of the things that's always banned in totalitarian regimes. I'm just reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Of course, he does 8 years in the camps because he satirized Stalin in some private letters. So satire definitely has a good function. I think where it becomes problematic is when it's used simply to tear down, when it's simply used to tear down, when it becomes, if you like, an agent of the transgressive, destructive, burn it to the ground kind of culture. That's why, it's interesting, a lot of satire today on the television tends to only focus on one set of enemies. The day you turn on Saturday Night Live and find the Democratic Party being mocked in the same way as the Republican Party, at that point, I think one can say, well, yeah, human pretensions are being cut down here. As it stands, it's simply one more tool in the political arsenal if it only faces one way. So I would say it's not satire in general that is necessarily the death work. It's when satire is used either as an end in itself or simply a tool of reinforcing an utterly cynical view of reality that it becomes a problem. It's a tool, and it's a tool that is as virtuous or as vice-ridden as the hand that wields it for a particular purpose.
It's still a good warning, though, to us, isn't it? I mean, as youth workers, that it's like every other medium. It's not just totally neutral. I mean, It'll be misused if we're not using it wisely. I'm sorry, Walt, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was going to say, it's like a,
let me follow up on that and ask you a question, Duffy. Because you were picking Carl's brain on that, and I'm intrigued by this conversation. What are some concerns that, being entrenched in the youth ministry world, what are some concerns specifically about satire that you would have? Kind of on the heels of what Carl just said, are there some warnings that you would issue?
Well, precisely what Carl said at the end there about cynicism. I've often said that cynicism is the wisdom of the simple. In other words, you see, cynicism is sort of the luxury of, you see it very, very simple, black and white, and it's all bad or it's all good. And it quite often, it's more complex than that. It's like Carl said about Republicans, Democrats, there's not just one bad guy, and there's not just one good guy. And I do think that I do see that cynicism sometimes where it's just too easy to say, well, I mean, in youth ministry land,
Elders and pastors, elder boards and pastors.
Elder board, but I would say even more pointed the finger at ourselves. I mean, right now the big kind of meta narrative is that church is dying, and that youth ministry is failing, and those statements a lot of times those statements are being made by people who came through churches and youth ministries and had their faith nurtured. And so I think it's just too easy to just, like Carl said, kind of burn the idol on the one hand, or burn the fuel and then turn around and go, this is really sacrosanct. I think we're going to find out that we're throwing stuff out of the cockpit that we're going to need to land the plane.
Carl, what are some other, practically speaking, just to raise the awareness of parents and youth workers, what are some other, I use the term delivery mechanisms, but where are some other places we need to be keenly aware that this social imaginary, it's being communicated in powerful ways and we might not be aware of it, or the Deathworks being delivered? Where would you advise people to look?
Well, I think you can even look within the church itself. One of the things I did this term in my Charles Taylor course, I got a bunch of undergraduates. We read the whole of A Secular Age together. I was hugely impressed by the kids I had in class. And one of the things I got them to do at one point was, okay, offer me a reflection paper on how Taylor's notion of the immanent frame, this idea that this world is sort of all that there is, how's that shaped the thinking of the church? And I was struck by many of the answers I received. And I think praise songs, and please don't interpret this as it's a crusty old Presbyterian bashing contemporary worship. It isn't. I'm happy to do that if you want me to, but I'm trying to avoid it. Yeah. One of the things is a lot of praise songs, which are very absorbed with, what God can do for me, and how God can alter things to make me happy. That, I think, is a delivery mechanism. One of the things I would say is that though we've often had those songs in church history, it's just that history is it's like acid. It dissolves the rubbish. The Wesleys wrote a lot of rubbish. We maybe sing 20 Wesley hymns now out of the hundreds they wrote. So it really isn't a whack at the contemporary scene, but it's to say that the church itself can actually get caught up in this kind of emotive, individualistic, expressivist way of thinking, or can that cliche, the church is too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. I have to confess, I've rarely come across a Christian in my entire life who's so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. Heavenly mindedness is not a strong suit in the church today. During the times of COVID, I was reading some of the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer about those who are sick, and it's fascinating that the concern in the Book of Common Prayer is about the judgment to come. It's not, we pray that this person will get well, but more than that, we're worried about what's going to happen to him if and when he dies. That's incomprehensible to a lot of Christians today. yes, we believe in heaven, but we live as if this world is all that there really is. So I would say one of the delivery mechanisms that Christians need to be most aware of is actually, if I can use the term in its broadest sense, the liturgies of the churches we attend. Do they reflect the biblical balance of heaven and earth, the biblical priorities, or are they the thinking of the world in a Christian idiom, sort of just piped into the church?
Consumerism, right? It's consumerism. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to jump in on it just a minute, Carl, because that reminds me of another part of the book I wanted to ask about. And Walt and I, when we do our doctor ministry thing at Gordon Conwell, we have our students read Tom Bergler's book, From Faith to Maturity, and the Juvenilization of American Christianity.
Yeah.
And I had my students read it this semester at Grove City, and we actually brought Bergler in for an interview on Zoom. But because it gets very, as you know, Bergler very much is concerned about what you were talking about, the sort of romanticism. He actually says that a lot of worship music, and this is going to make some of our listeners very angry. It did my students. But he said it sounds like a slow dance song, and it reminded me of your discussion in here a little bit about the romanticists and how they have impacted thinking. And I'm just gonna mention two ideas, and I'd like to kind of respond to this stuff, if you will. One is recently I saw on a website for a curriculum publisher this landing page. The phrase said, "We want to help you create a better experience this week for kids and teenagers," which is an interesting statement, right? Because it's very much what you said. It's more of the romanticist type of appeal. And then the other thought is that I really value and take as valid C.S. Lewis's conversation about the importance of not just looking at, but looking along. And I don't and so I'm trying to figure out, like, you talk about poetry in the book, and I'm a big reader of Eugene Peterson, and he loves poetry and feels poetry like the way to really get in touch with God. How do we tie into that so that students can look at biblical truth and not just get a lot of fuzzy romanticist stuff, but how at the same time do we recognize, as you said a little bit earlier, that everything is not this rational thinking person, that there's a lot more to the social imaginary than that. Sorry, it's a big question.
No, it's a very good question, Duffy. And again, as I said about satire, there's a sort of positive and a negative. Satire itself is it's a tool. I would say the Romantics, in many ways, what the Romantics touch on, they touch on important stuff. And Taylor is very good on this. And I like Taylor, I have deep affinities with 19th century Romanticism, precisely because I think it gets at that point that reason is not enough, or the Christian equivalent would be simply assenting to doctrine is not enough, that there is an affective dimension to Christianity. It is meant to grab our whole being, not just our minds. So I'd want to say that first thing is, the Romantics are onto something, that our loves are very important to who we are. And that, I think, is addressed by Christianity. That yes, love is an important element of Orthodox Christianity. So the big question is, how do we as Christians capitalize on that insight or respond to that insight without heading down the kind of Henry David Thoreau, Percy Bysshe Shelley kind of line, where it all becomes almost a kind of mystical power of nature idea. I think the Psalms
to give people an experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think experience is important, but it has to be refracted through that biblical lens, and that's where I think the Psalms are important. And my wife and I, she was brought up in, and I was an elder in a Psalms only church back in Scotland, for some years before moving to the United States. I'm not an exclusive psalmist by conviction, but I love singing the Psalms. And one of the things I love about the Psalms is that they do give you a vocabulary or a vision of Christian experience that connects with emotions. And it doesn't matter if it's despair or elation. It's there in the Psalms somewhere. And of course, because the Psalms are divinely inspired and they're just how God wants them to be, we also get the correct context, the grammar and the syntax of that. So I think that one of the things that we should be doing is spending more time reflecting upon the implications of the Psalms for how we understand Christian experience. It's not that we're to flee from Christian experience, but it's that we are to see Christian experience framed by biblical piety. And I think that the return of the Psalms in worship, which I've seen in many churches over the last 10, 15 years, is a good thing. One of the most encouraging things I've come across at Grove, and it might seem odd for a Presbyterian to say this, but so many of the kids that I speak to in class, I'll say, where do you go to church? And they'll say, Grace Anglican. Mm-hmm. And I'll say, well, are you an Anglican in background? They say, no, we were at a Bible church. And I always press on them the need to express appreciation for the church, the pastor who cared for them and the church they came up through, regardless of what they think about it. But what's interesting is their move to Grace Anglican has been, they love the liturgy. They love both the sense of historic continuity and belonging and the way it provides them with a rich vocabulary for expressing their deepest feelings in a way that is biblically reverent. And that's been striking to me. I have a colleague, not in our department, but a colleague said to me that Grove City Student Rebellion is coming from a Bible church and attending Grace Anglican when they arrive. Yeah. It's interesting to me that, they want this emotional experience, but they know that in and of itself, that's not enough. It has to be framed within some bigger theological and liturgical context.
Because we do have those, as we're talking about, thinking about those services at night sometimes in the chapel where they just turn all the lights off, maybe not in COVID times, and the Warriors service. There's still that longing for the experiential and looking along.
Yeah.
But there is a real appreciation. I hear the same thing about Grace Anglican.
Yeah,
there is real appreciation for that.
I would also point students towards Augustine's Confessions, because in many ways, to use Reef terms, he's a kind of psychological man. The actions all taking place in here. He's a true disciple of the Apostle Paul. It's the inner life that's key. And yet the interesting thing about Augustine is he goes inwards in order ultimately to move outwards. Whereas, the modern man moves inwards because that's where it ends. It terminates on this inward move. I am who I am inside. And Augustine, he moves inwards to think, this is how I feel, and now I need to move outwards and set that in the context of the divine economy.
One of the downfalls of me getting this advanced reader copy is I go to the back and it says index to come. So I don't have it, but I'm trying to remember, Carl, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but the term emotivism.
Yeah.
Did you use that in the book, or am I reading that?
Yes.
Page 83.
Yeah, it's a term that used by Alistair McIntyre to talk about, really to talk about what's going on in ethical discourse today, that we think we're talking about right and wrong, or we're actually talking about emotional preferences.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and we need to take a break here. But you and I were both speaking ahead of time. I'm in the process of. You have read Tara Isabella Burton's book Strange Rites, which I think is on the bestseller list now, subtitled "New Religions for a Godless World." Duffy has it, and he pulled it off his shelf. We'll get him reading that soon. But she would be fascinating to have on, because what she's describing is basically the outcome of everything you've talked about in your book. And, we need to be aware of this. Well, let's take a break. We'll be right back. We'll continue our conversation with Carl Trueman and Duffy Robbins.
If you enjoy listening to Youth Culture Matters and would like to support the ongoing efforts of this ministry, you can do so by visiting cpyu.org/giving to make a donation. Your prayers and financial support make this podcast possible.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We're talking with Carl Trueman, professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. And of course, I'm with my friend Walt Mueller. We're having a great conversation. I'm glad you're here. Carl, one of the other figures that you've mentioned in your book, and there are several just key thinkers, but one is Nietzsche. And one of the concepts that you associate with Nietzsche is his notion of freedom. In particular, you say that for freedom, for Nietzsche, freedom is the freedom of self-creation. And it strikes me in our culture today that self-creation, cultivating your own online identity, such a big part of where adolescents, well, people of all ages are. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, he fits into the narrative, Nietzsche, as a very important figure. With the Romantics, we talked about the Romantics a little bit earlier. With Rousseau and the Romantics, you have this inward move where the real me is the voice of nature within me. By the time you get to Nietzsche in the 19th century, Nietzsche's the guy who really calls the bluff on that idea. He essentially says, there's no such thing as human nature. And what that means is it's not that Nietzsche denies that human beings share a common biological makeup. We can reproduce each other, but we can't reproduce with other species, for example. It's not that he denies that. What Nietzsche is denying is that there's any external authority, there's any moral structure to human nature to which we have to conform. And Nietzsche's the guy who not only connects that dot, but then draws a conclusion from it. The conclusion is, therefore, to be a human being is to be you in whichever way you choose to do so. You need to break free of these constraints that are placed upon you by moral codes, predominantly Christianity, and cut your own path, your own lonely but glorious path in this world. And of course, that's often associated in the popular mind with Nietzsche's notion of the Superman, the Übermensch, which is then often refracted through the lens of Nazism and Adolf Hitler, and this idea that Nietzsche's Superman is a sort of a master race kind of figure. Well, I think a more accurate example of what Nietzsche would have envisioned as the Superman, or this human being cutting his own path, would be a man like Oscar Wilde in the late 19th century. If I have one regret about the book, Wilde really deserved a chapter to himself. In many ways, he's a great harbinger of the present age. He's a sexual rebel. He does his own thing, and his life is one long willful performance. Oscar Wilde is Oscar Wilde's own greatest creation. And what Wilde did as an elite, at an elite level, is now what we all do. Social media is what? It's a mode of performance. There's a great article on the internet recently by the Catholic philosopher D.C. Schindler. I think it was "Social Media is Hate Speech" was the title of it. And the burden of that was, things like Twitter really only exist for most of us for self-promotion and for the projection of a certain image, the creation of a certain person out there. And so this, the Nietzschean move, I think, is the move to self-creation, life as performance, life as art, as Nietzsche would say it. And that's where we all are now, in the hands of an Oscar Wilde. That was a brilliant idea. And who doesn't love Oscar Wilde's witticisms and his plays and his stories and his essays? I often say, if there was one man who could have done, if there were two men who could have done Twitter well, three men could have done Twitter well, Luther, Nietzsche, and Oscar Wilde. Nobody else can do Twitter like those guys would have done it. But it's become a sort of a kind of more demotic thing now. We can all do this self-invention. Technology has enabled us all to live as Oscar Wildes, and that's a large part of life now. It's tragically why even in Pittsburgh the last couple of weeks, a young man committed suicide because he was subject to mockery online. Well, of course, one could say he was being, his performance was not being recognized. And that's not a criticism of him, but it's to say the people we are online now is very important to who we are. Our performance is very important to who we are. So that would be where I would see Nietzsche kind of playing or anticipating the modern scene.
Just to follow up on that, Taylor, one of the themes that runs through his book, A Secular Age, that I think is most valuable above and beyond, immanent frame, transcendent frame, but just as that whole idea of expressive individualism. I know Robert Bellah talked about that as well. And that's what you're talking. I mean, that really is so much at the root of what you're talking about here, especially as it relates to social media. And we all feel that pressure when we are on there, to kind of get with the times, to go with the flow of
to curate this self, this identity.
Yeah. So again, this is where I think, Carl, what you're saying is so important for us to hear. When you mention some of these names of thinkers of old and thought shapers of old, who many of us in the Christian church would you mention the name and we'd automatically push back. But then when you start to unpack what they were saying and what they were promoting, and I look in the mirror and I say, oh my goodness, it's appalling when you start to see this is what we're following. We've absorbed this. These Deathworks have come through all these channels in pop culture. We've absorbed it just because we swim in it and marinate it without even knowing it. So that being said, give us what would be some you're sitting with your students, let's say they're getting ready to launch into their adult lives beyond college, beyond the university. What's some wisdom you would pass on to them about living the Christian life counterculturally to the glory of God in light of these things? Talk to us about social media, for example. What could a youth worker hear from you about good social media practices, or what do we need to communicate, parents and youth workers, to our kids about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge questions to which I don't have any sort of magic answers at all. I mean, there's the common sense advice about, limit your time on these things. Is it a good stewardship of time to be tweeting out? And I preached numerous occasions when I'm a pastor. My application would be, don't spend your time trying to influence people that you don't even know and you can never have any influence over, and neglect the real people in the pew next to you that you could actually influence in a very profound and positive way. So I think there's a general reorientation towards the real that needs to take place. And it may well be that some social media is simply not appropriate for many Christians. I don't do Twitter. I don't do Facebook. I don't feel my life is particularly impoverished because of that. We need to learn to live without some of these things.
Are you on Zanga?
What?
Carl is on MySpace.
I stopped him. I had him respond and say, what? That's like one of the first social media platforms. I'm sorry, that was very rude of me.
I'm on LinkedIn, but I never use it. I just accept people, but I've never actually
tweet that out that we stumped him there. Tweet that out.
That's right. So, I mean, one great thing about LinkedIn is that it does accept you. And in this day and age, you're going, you know what? I needed that. Thank you.
Yeah. So I definitely think that's the case. I think pastors and elders need to set a tone on this as well. I think they need to lead from the front. I was on a podcast just yesterday, and I was commenting that one of the most striking things to me about Paul's qualifications for elders is that actually none of those qualifications, with the possible exception of being able to teach, is anything that every Christian shouldn't aspire to. Being faithful to your wife, that's not an elite thing. That's what every Christian should be doing. Not going out and getting drunk every Saturday. That's what every Christian should be doing. So I think that the elders of churches, or however you can, every church is going to have its equivalent of elders. Whoever the equivalent of the elders are in your church, they have a huge responsibility to set the tone by leading by example, not only in what's said from the pulpit, but what is reflected in their everyday lives, in the hospitality they extend, in the friendships they have, in the way they carry themselves. They have an obligation, I think, to model a way of life that is countercultural on these points. So I would say that there is an ecclesiastical component to this solution. Pastors need to address these things from the pulpit. We have to be careful that we don't degenerate into just legalism, a set of do's and don'ts. But I think pastors have to set forward a vision of the Christian life in what they preach that will help congregants set these things in their proper context. So there's a whole variety of things that we talked earlier on about praise. The songs we sing, whether they're contemporary or traditional, the songs we sing need to set forth an appropriate vision and set the tone of the Christian life. I can't imagine any hymn having the phrase social media in it, but I can imagine hymns that set a vision for the Christian life that would allow the thoughtful person to realize, well, actually, this has implications for me in this particular area.
There's a lot of wisdom there. And I think everything that you just said, you prefaced it, a lot of it with pastors, youth workers, youth pastors. I mean, we're involved in the high calling of the shaping kids spiritually. And I think many times, we actually foster expressive individualism through our forms and through the theology that we teach. And I think, we fuel the extension of the social imaginary through the culture and even on down through time. So, these are great thoughts. Duffy,
I was just going to say, Walt, that I think it would be possible, for someone to listen to today's podcast and hear all of these names and hear them cited by, a college professor and go, okay, well, that's like for the higher echelons of education. But it goes back actually to a comment that we were talking about way early in the podcast, and that, why did the Twin Towers fall? And it's easy for, parents and youth workers to go, well, here's this problem, here's this problem, and here's this problem, without really reflecting on the laws of gravity that are pulling all of the forces that are pulling all these things. And that's where I would really encourage folks to take a look at, Carl's book. That's where I found it really, really thoughtful, really insightful. This is not just for academia. It's not an easy read. Carl would concede that it's not, Dick and Jane go to the Holy Land, but it has some great insights for those who are willing to read it. They'll be greatly rewarded.
Yeah, and Duffy, let me just point out the fact that that was the title that came off your lips there. Dick and Jane go to the Holy Land. That and my presence and your presence here is clear evidence that this was not a book just for these conversations, but not just for the upper echelons of academia, right? That we're here. Seriously, as I've gotten older, and I hope wiser, these are the kinds of things, what Carl has written here in this book, these are the kinds of things that we really need to tackle. And Duffy's right, it's not an easy read, but these are the kinds of things that we need to tackle and immerse ourselves in, because ideas have consequences, ideas matter. And I truly believe, Carl's a historian. When history looks back on this particular period of time, I hope it will remember that we have thought well and responded well in the church. Carl, I know we need to wrap up here, but any parting words that you would have for folks, just as an encouragement, to parents and to youth workers who are parenting and ministering in these unique times that we live in?
Yeah, I think one of the burdens of the book was it's not a lamentation. There's great temptation in Christian circles throughout the centuries to always lament the present as being somehow worse than the past. The book is not a lamentation. The book is really a description and analysis so that we know, if you like, we know the hand of cards we've been dealt in order to play the game effectively at this particular point in time. I think there are some real points of encouragement. I think one of the burdens of the book, and this may sound like an odd point of encouragement, but one of the burdens of the book is that the church is going to be more marginalized in culture in the I think the fairly near future. That could be a good thing, because that gives us, marginal cultures are often strong communities. Think of the Amish in Lancaster County, or just 15 miles from where I'm sitting now. They're strong communities, in some ways precisely because of their countercultural marginality. So I think there are real opportunities here for the church to regroup and strengthen itself, and to focus on the things that really matter. Secondly, I would say to parents, think of the second thief on the cross. The second thief on the cross, suddenly at the very end of his life, he's got all this great theology. He knows God's holy. He knows there's a judgment coming. And he knows that Jesus is going to become king through his death rather than by escaping from his death. My question when I preached on that text is always, when does he learn that stuff? He doesn't learn it on the cross. He's presumably taught well by his parents when he was a kid. Right. And yet, it didn't have any relevance to him until the one moment when it really needed to be relevant. So I would say to parents who teach your kids well, and if you don't see immediate fruit, then that is a sad and frustrating thing, but it's not a cause for despair. Your task as a parent is to do your job well, and to trust that the knowledge you're giving your kids will be important at the moment when it's important. And thirdly, remember that the church wins. We get very wrapped up with what's happening in front of our eyes. We see the church in the West declining. The church is growing gangbusters in parts of the world where we don't see the faces, we just hear the statistics, and statistics are always less real than a face. But the church is growing, and we have the promise that the gates of hell will not prevail. The church in America may pass away, but that doesn't invalidate the promise that is the church will prevail. The bride will meet the bridegroom at the marriage feast of the Lamb at some point. So I think there are all kinds of reasons for not optimism. I like Rod Dreher's distinction between, he says, we're not optimistic, we're hopeful. I think there are tremendous reasons for hope at this particular point in time.
Well, I want to thank you for the book. It's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution, published by Crossway. Something you just said there, Carl, makes me realize that this book is really one that's helping us be a better bride, and to really serve the bridegroom well. So thank you for that. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Carl has his own podcast. That's where he cuts up on other people. I love how you go after Todd Pruitt from time to time. That's always fun to listen to. But the podcast is called Mortification of Spin. Duffy and I are both fans. And again, what you'll hear there, and you guys do that weekly, correct?
We do. So one comes out each week. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a whole archive of those, Mortification of Spin, that you can go back through, and some fascinating topics, and all of them really bring together a good look at scripture and faith and culture and the role of the church in today's world. And so that's one that Duffy and I would recommend. So thank you for joining us. Duffy, any final words?
No, thanks a lot, Walt, for having us. And Carl, thanks again for doing what you do at Grove City College, man. I really appreciate your impact on my students. And if you're listening and you have high school students under your influence, we would love to invest in your ministry by teaching them at Grove City.
We would. And great to have you as a colleague, Duffy. The feeling is mutual.
Yeah, that was good. Chris, send him a bill for that little marketing moment there. That's good. I like that. But, hey, I often say, I really respect you guys and what's happening at Grove City. So kudos for that. If you want to follow Carl on Twitter, it's #MeatloafRocks.
My cover is blown.
Yeah. Carl, Duffy, thank you so much. Chris, as always, thanks for helping us make this all work. And again, I'll remind everybody, go to cpyu.org, look for the player for this particular episode of the podcast, scroll down. You'll find links to everything that's been mentioned and more. So thanks for joining us, and we'll chat with you on the next episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.